Good afternoon, friends. This is Dr. Bharti Garg from the Department of Public Administration, Punjab University, Chandigarh. Today we are going to discuss the topic of ethics in public life, anti-corruption mechanism, legal and institutional framework in the country. At the end of this module, you will be able to understand the meaning of ethics, various dimensions and approaches of ethics, code of conduct for the civil servants, ministers, regulators, judges, the meaning of corruption, and various institutional mechanisms that has been set up in the country to deal with corruption like CVC, CBI, and various legal mechanisms like Prevention of Corruption Act, etc. Firstly, let us take up what is ethics. Ethics is a system of accepted beliefs and morals which guide human behavior. More specifically, it is a system based on morals. Ethics is the study of what is morally right and what is not right. The Latin origin of the word ethics is ethicus, which means character. Hence, ethics is based on moral principles which govern individual or group's behavior. It is difficult to define ethics, and different views have been associated with the very definition of ethics. Many people equate ethics with feelings, but following one's feeling may not mean that one is following ethical path. One may deviate from ethical values when following one's feelings. Some identify ethics with religion, but if ethics is equated with religion, then ethics would apply only to religious people, whereas ethics are equally acceptable and applicable to people who are atheist as equally applicable to people who are religious in nature. Further, being ethical is not the same as law, though law tries to adopt ethical principles in its formulation. For example, pre-Civil War slavery laws and apartheid laws in South Africa, they were not at all ethical in nature. So law, like feelings, can deviate from the ethical principles. Finally, being ethical is not what the society accepts individuals to do. The standards set by the society can make the entire society ethically corrupt. Nazi Germany is the best example of ethically corrupt society. If being ethical is doing what the society accepts us to do, then we would have to survey all the societies to determine what is ethical and what the society expects us to do. Further, lack of consensus on many issues in society makes it difficult to equate ethics with what the society accepts us to do. For example, many people may be thinking that abortion is legal and ethical, whereas others may not. So there is lack of consensus on a particular issue or on large number of issues makes it difficult to equate ethics with what society wants us to do. What then is ethics? Ethics refer to two things. Firstly, it refers to the moral principles that guide individuals, what they should do and should not do in terms of moral values and obligations. These standards which guide what humans should do and should not do, they are based on standard patterns which the society accepts. And they are based on well-founded reasons and principles. Secondly, ethics refers to the development of standards which an individual set for one's own self. For example, what an individual himself or herself feels is what is right or wrong. For example, if a friend asks you to copy your homework, it is your ethical dilemma whether you will tell teacher or not. That you have to decide for yourself. Whenever you have to choose a decision that your action will make an impact on someone else, you face an ethical dilemma. The decision you make is ethical when you choose to do the right thing, having a positive impact on others rather than negatively impacting them. Now we are going to discuss the approaches to ethical decision making. Friends, there are 5 approaches to ethical decision making. First, the utilitarian approach. Second, the rights approach. Third, the fairness and justice approach. Fourth is the goodness approach, and fifth is the virtues approach. The utilitarian approach was given by Jeremy Bentham and J.S. Mill in the 19th century. This approach helps legislatures to determine which laws are the best, as the utilitarian approach goes by the principle to determine the greatest good over the evil. The rights approach has its roots in the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant. He focused on individuals' right to choose for himself. The fairness and justice approach has its roots in the teachings of the philosopher Aristotle. The basic moral question in this approach is, how fair is an action? Is it treating everyone equally, or is it creating discrimination among people? The common good approach goes by the maxim that individuals' own good is associated with the community's good. The virtue approach says that the ideals for which we strive for, like courage, honesty, fidelity, transparency, they must be promoted in the society. And these virtues we must approach with all our effort and should help in the development of humanity at large. Okay friends, till this point we have discussed the theoretical aspects of ethics, what is ethics and what are the various dimensions of ethics. Now ethics is a very important aspect of administration, because public life is life which makes an impact on individuals at large in society. And since administrators, politicians, legislatures, they are the policy makers and policy implementers, so the decisions and the actions they take, they make an impact on the society at large. So it is believed that their actions must be ethical. So from this point onwards, we are going to discuss ethics in public life in India. If we see what is public life is a life where the decisions of those at the helm of affairs, they are making an impact on the entire society. For instance, the legislatures, the politicians, the civil servants, the judges, the regulators who are involved in policy making, policy implementation and policy arbitration. Now their decisions with regard to policy making, policy implementation, policy arbitration, they are making an impact on public at large, on society at large. So their decisions, their role in policy making, implementation and arbitration must be guided by ethics and various approaches to ethical values, so that the decisions they take, they are ethical in nature and impacts the society in a positive manner. Thus, people who are engaged in various leadership positions in the organization and are making an impact on the lives of people are to varying degrees involved in public life. So any framework of ethical behavior must include the following elements. First, codifying ethical norms and practices. Second, disclosing personal interest. Third, creating a mechanism for enforcing ethical codes. Fourth, providing norms for qualifying and disqualifying a public functionary from office. The Committee on Standards in Public Life in the United Kingdom, popularly known as Nolan Committee, has outlined 7 principles of ethics in public life. First, selflessness. Second, integrity. Third, objectivity. Fourth, accountability. Fifth, openness. Sixth, honesty. Seventh, leadership. Now friends, let us discuss the code of ethics for civil servants in India. Civil service is an executive arm of the government. It is the most important wing of the state which is involved in policy formulation and implementation in a big way. Now, since it is involved in policy formulation and policy implementation, it has over the years acquired immense powers, and thus keeping it exposed to the abuse of that power. And it has been rightly observed and noted that civil services over the years has actually abused its power, acquired immense power, and is working more for its own vested interest than for the interest of the society at large. Following cases of corruption and financial scandals against the civil servants around the world, the governments in different countries have been emphasizing on adopting ethical standards for civil servants. United Nations has adopted a convention against corruption. OECD has also adopted a convention against corrupt bureaucrats and which is acting against the officials from taking bribe from the other officials from different countries. In India, all the categories of civil servants, that is central civil servants, state civil servants and all India service officers, they are guided by Central Civil Service Conduct Rules 1964. In India, we don't have any ethical code of conduct. We only have do's and don'ts for the civil servants. Friends, now we are going to briefly discuss the list of do's and don'ts for the civil servants in India. Firstly, we will discuss what are the do's for the civil servants in India, that is, what they can do while being in service. First, maintain absolute integrity at all times. Maintain absolute devotion to duty at all times. Responsible and decent behavior in private life. Independence and impartiality in public life. Render prompt service to public. Observe proper decorum during breaks. Keeping away from demonstrations. Manage private affairs in such a way so as to avoid indebtedness and insolvency. Maintain political neutrality. Now let us discuss few of the don'ts, that is, what the civil servants are not required to do while being in service. First, do not make joint representation in matters of common interest. Do not indulge in facts which are unbecoming of a government servant. Do not be discourteous, dishonest, and partial. Do not adopt dilatory practices in your public dealings. Do not convey oral instructions to your subordinates. Do not associate yourselves with banned organizations. This list of do's and don'ts is not exhaustive in nature but only illustrative in nature. This list of do's and don'ts cover matters like property transactions and taking of the gifts while being in service, etc. But it has been found that this list of do's and don'ts, also called as conduct rules, they are highly restrictive in nature, restricting the freedom of the government employee in dealing with the situations and in taking decisions. They are couched in vague language, thus opening the ground for the officer to be indulged in corrupt and malfeasance activities. Thus, it is time to discard these rules and enact a code of conduct for the civil servants so that even they can function in a streamlined manner. So, it is time to bring in new code of ethics for the civil servants. The Second Administrative Reforms Commission in its 4th report has given detailed outline of ethics for the civil servants in India. The second ARC in its recommendations has proposed that there should be detailed code of ethics for the civil servants, ministers, legislatures and judicial officers. It has recommended the creation of Lokpal and Ombudsman to deal with complaints of corruption against the civil servants. It recommended that public service values towards which all public servants should aspire should be clearly highlighted and laid down. And conflict of interest should be clearly laid down in the Code of Ethics. The need of the hour is to establish an effective Code of Ethics for the civil servants in India, and the British Code of Ethics can be a model to establish an effective Code of Ethics for civil servants in India also. Violation of the Code of Ethics should invite punishment and punitive action. There is a need to create an independent Office of Ethics Commissioner on the lines of US Ethics Commissioner to provide leadership in establishing Code of Ethics for the civil servants and provide leadership to establish values. Now, the next aspect with which second ARC had dealt with was ethical framework for ministers. Number of developed countries like UK, USA and Canada has prescribed code of ethics for the minister. On the similar lines, even in India, we have adopted a code of ethics for the ministers. This code of conduct relates to accepting gifts, conduct in office, while starting, opening or joining any other new business venture, disclosing the details of assets, liabilities, buying property, selling property, or taking contribution from any individual or organization either for political purpose or for personal interest, etc. Friends, this is the cover page of the second ARC's fourth report on ethics in public life. It is a detailed document highlighting the recommendations given by second ARC on establishing code of conduct for the civil servants, ministers, legislatures, and regulators. The code for ministers also involves not accepting the gifts for personal interest or not taking any kind of favors or gifts through the spouse, and as far as possible while on official tours, staying in government guest houses or in government accommodations rather than taking any favors from private individuals. Now these are the recommendations given by second ARC for establishing a code of ethics for the ministers. The list is not comprehensive, and for details you can refer to fourth report of second ARC. Instead of code of conduct, there should be code of ethics for the ministers to guide them how they should behave and deal while holding a public office. Ministers must keep their roles as ministers and constituency members separate. Ministers must uphold the principle of collective responsibility. Ministers must ensure that no conflict of interest arises between public office and private interest. Ministers must not use government resources for party purposes or for personal purposes. Ministers must uphold highest ethical standards. Friends, we are going to discuss the ethical framework for legislatures. Now, legislature is an important pillar in a democratic form of government. Now, since legislature comprises of the representatives of the people, so it is very important that there should be code of conduct and code of ethics for the legislatures also, because they sit in the legislature and they frame policies for the welfare of the people. Various countries of the world like Canada, USA, UK, they have adopted code of ethics for the legislatures. In India, there is a committee on code of ethics for legislatures in each house of the parliament. It oversees ethical and moral conduct of the legislatures, criminalization of politics, and the electoral process. The existing framework of the code of conduct for the members of both Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha provides that they must maintain their conduct in a manner that public reposes trust in them. They should work diligently to discharge their duties for the common good of the public, and they must uphold the highest integrity while performing the duties and give full respect to the Constitution of the country. Second ARC has also given detailed recommendations to establish code of ethics for the legislatures in India. The list here mentioned is not exhaustive. For details, refer to fourth report of second ARC. The first recommendation given by second ARC is the establishment of the Office of Ethics Commissioner to oversee the issues of ethics amongst the legislatures. In respect of states, the second ARC has recommended that there should be exhaustive list of code of ethics for the state legislatures, and ethics committees be constituted in the state assemblies. The register of members' interest should also be maintained, where the entire details of the property and assets of the ministers be laid down. Office of Ethics Commissioners should also be established in the state legislatures. The law should be amended to clearly define the office of profit so that conflict of interest can be dealt with. Next, we are going to discuss ethics for regulators. There are code of conducts for the professionals and the traders. The prescription of code of conduct for different sections of the society is generally through regulatory bodies. For example, guilds is an oldest example where they have been enforcing ethical conduct and ethical behavior for the businessmen. The last century has seen the emergence of services sector in a big way. These professions had initially organized themselves on their own and established their own standards of behavior, which are known as standard ethical behavioral practices. In some cases, such behavioral practices were given statutory backing. For example, Indian Medical Council Act 1956. It has often been found that these new professions that have come up and are associated with the services sector are not following ethical norms and practices, and whatever ethical norms and behaviors they are following, they are lacking teeth and are not up to the mark, serving only vested interests. However, the second ARC feels that there should be ethical code of conduct for the services sector also, and detailed ethical code of conduct should be laid down for the regulators also. For details, refer to 4th report of second ARC. Now friends, we are going to discuss ethics for judiciary. Now judiciary is one of the most important pillars in a democratic society. On it rests the edifice of the entire justice system of the country. But unfortunately, even the judicial system around the world, including India, has been found to be indulging into corrupt practices. Judges, like other wings of the state, like politicians or civil servants or legislatures, are found to be involving in corrupt practices. Thus, it has become imperative that there should be ethical code of conduct for judges also. In India, we have an ethical code of conduct for judges also. First, judicial decisions to be honest. Second, parties to the dispute should be treated equally. Judge trying a case is himself on trial. Distance should be maintained from the parties to the dispute and their lawyers. Media publicity to be avoided. Participation in social functions to be avoided. The second ARC in its 4th report has given detailed recommendations on establishing ethical code of conduct for the judges. It has firstly recommended the establishment of a new law so that judges of both Supreme Court and High Courts can be brought under the legal ambit. It has been found that the internal mechanism set up by the judiciary to establish ethical standards and the impeachment procedure provided in the Constitution of India is not workable, and still, despite these mechanisms, unethical practices have crept into the judicial process. So there is a need of a new law which can establish ethical behavioral standards for the judges. The next recommendation of the second ARC is the establishment of the National Judicial Council by amending Article 124 of the Indian Constitution, which shall be involved in the appointment of the judges of the Supreme Court and High Court and having representation from legislature, executive and judiciary. The National Judicial Council will have the following members: Vice President of the country as chairperson of the council, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the country, the Prime Minister of the country, Leader of Opposition in Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, the Law Minister of the country as its members. And in case of states, the Chief Minister of the concerned state and Chief Justice of the concerned High Court will also be included. The National Judicial Council will be authorized to lay down code of conduct for the judges, including the subordinate judiciary. The judge of the Supreme Court should be designated as the Judicial Values Commissioner. He should be assigned the task of enforcing the code of conduct for the judges, and the same holds true with regard to state high courts also. Okay friends, till this point we have seen what is ethics, what are the meaning of ethics, and what are approaches to ethical decision making, and how ethics make an impact on public life and why ethics are important in public life. We have also discussed what the Government of India has done to establish ethical code of conduct for the civil servants, ministers, legislators, judiciary officers, as well as for the regulators. And second ARC in its 4th report on ethics in public life has given detailed recommendations for establishing ethical code of conduct for ministers, civil servants, legislatures, judiciary, as well as for regulators. But despite all these initiatives, the corruption in our country is on the rise. Corruption is not just for monetary gains, it is taking any kind of favors which is also beyond monetary gains. It may be staying in somebody's guest house, or it may be taking any non-monetary favors. So corruption, we have seen, is on the rise in our country. This has made all the more imperative to establish ethical code of conduct in our country. Now, though it is necessary to establish ethical code of conduct in our country, we have strong institutional and legal framework in our country to deal with corruption and to establish ethical conduct of our officers. Now, the most important agencies, institutional framework in our country to deal with corruption is CBI and CVC, that is Central Bureau of Investigation and Central Vigilance Commission. CBI is the non-statutory agency which is assisting the government in dealing with the corruption and is providing help to the Central Vigilance Commission in investigating the cases of corruption against officials in public life. Central Vigilance Commission was set up in 1962 on the recommendations of Santhanam Committee, and it receives complaints directly from the citizens against corruption of public officials, and with the help of CBI, it investigates cases of corruption and recommends disciplinary action against the officials. Now, apart from CBI and CVC, every state has set up its own vigilance machinery to deal with corruption of the state level officials or politicians. And recently we have also set up Lokpal to deal with corruption of highest levels of officers and politicians. Every state has also set up Lokayuks to deal with the corrupt practices of officials. The Government of India has also enacted Right to Information Act, which is also helping in establishing transparency in administration, and somewhere it has also dealt a blow to the corrupt practices of the officials. Whistleblower Protection Act has been enacted by the Government of India, but it still remains to be notified in the Gazette. Apart from this, time to time, various Administrative Reforms Commission and Expenditure Reforms Commission has suggested various reform measures to deal with corrupt practices of the officials, bureaucrats, and politicians at different levels. To conclude, it can be said that ethics play a very important role in public life. The Government of India has laid down elaborative code of conduct not just for the ministers but for the civil servants, judiciary, regulators, as well as for the ministers. Now, despite this elaborative code of conduct, the corruption in the country is on the rise. We have set up elaborative legal and institutional framework to deal with corruption, but despite that, corruption in the country is on the increase, and every now and then we have been witness to scams of crores and crores of rupees. So it has become imperative that stringent measures be taken to establish ethical behavioral practices amongst those in public life and dealing with public, so that they can do no harm to public. Now it is time that we should adhere to the recommendations of second ARC and establish effective code of conduct and ethical practices for those in public life. Thus, ethics in public life are very important to establish citizen-oriented government and to ensure that citizens get the best of the government and the country has good governance institutions at place. Thank you.